So I decided to come back a little bit to a third pass at this little editorial, not for its own sake, but to make a point, perhaps, or show something. I've taught critical reasoning, critical thinking many times, and done it in many different ways, and I'm still sort of looking for the right way to do it that would be best for students. One way you can go about a critical reasoning course is spending a lot of time diagramming arguments. And what does that mean? What's the technique for diagramming arguments? Well, you go through an argument. Let's just say this one here, familiar with Tarred by Tobacco. And the first thing that you do is that you number every statement. That is, every individual proposition or statement in the argument gets assigned a number. So so when you make your diagram that shows the logical or inferential structure of the argument, you're just working with numbers that stand for different statements. For instance, this would be statement one. Health insurance and hospital companies that are members of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce find themselves in an uncomfortable situation. And then you would just go through everything that actually constitutes a statement. For instance, things that are true questions or orders or commands, things that don't make any claims about the world would not count as statements. But every declarative sentence basically would be assigned a number. That is, would be a numbered statement. And then you would use those numbers to create a diagram that shows the structure of the argument. I'll show you what I mean. Like if we take this first statement here. Okay, there it is. And then we look at the second statement, which is this one. One of the things that we realize right away is that there actually is this constitutes a little argument. That is within the overall argument of this editorial. This is, one might say, a little sub-argument, and then we would have to fit it into the overall structure of the argument later. But look at these two sentences here, these two statements. The first one makes a claim. The claim is that these companies are in an uncomfortable situation, which is just a bare claim when we read it, right? But then the second sentence supports it. Publicly, these companies support policies designed to reduce smoking, but the Chamber has opposed anti-smoking measures around the world. So if we, using the magic of word processing, we can display or make explicit can make explicit the inferential structure here by changing the order. Right? So clearly, so here the support or the premise comes first, and the conclusion that follows from it, or supposedly follows from it, or the inference comes second. And typically, again, let's see, we could just improvise here. And imagine that's a line with an arrow at the end. Right? And that would bring out the fact that, visually represent the idea that the first statement leads to the second. That's supposed to be a vertical arrow there, what's between the two statements. Right? And then in an actual diagram, it would look like this. That is, we've assigned numbers to the two statements so that we don't have to actually write out the statements. We just have numbers assigned, and then we use those numbers to create a visual diagram of the logical structure of what we're reading. That is, one leads to two. At least that is the claim. Now, whether it's valid reasoning would be something we would have to evaluate. But this is certainly what is meant. The inference in statement two, that is, two is inferred from one by the author of the editorial. So that's that's just one little chunk of this editorial. That little part there. I'm not going to do it because it's time consuming. It's well worth doing, learning how to do, but it doesn't seem to me, in my experience, that working out full diagrams of arguments for weeks and weeks on end is a good, really the best way to use the limited time we have for a class like this. But just to sort of skip to the end, I mean, there's stuff in here, as we saw in the previous videos, that definitely can be construed once we understand what the editorial is aiming towards. There's stuff in here that can be construed as further premises for the argument, for the conclusion to the argument. But that ultimate conclusion is here, as we saw. So if we had numbered all the statements, it would be given a number. But we're not going to do that because it takes a while to do. So we'll get rid of our numbering system. We could have done that. We could have numbered everything and had all the statements serve as or be represented by numbers. But when we begin to work out the structure, well, we'd see that this first statement here at the top supports the second statement, and that the second statement, within, again, if we would have to fill in all the other support, all the other premises, and perhaps little sub-arguments that are contained within this overall argument. But this second one, along with those other statements that we're not going to include, would actually lead to, our ultimate conclusion, which is that they ought to speak out, right? Basically, speak out about the practices, the pro-tobacco practices or tobacco advocacy of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So this is just a partial, like if we were actually going to come up with a really good and detailed and exhaustive, complete diagram of this argument, it would look a lot more complex than this. First of all, we would probably need to use numbers and do it in some other program, or do it by hand. Actually, is really the best way to do it, the easiest way to do it, to draw the arrows, the inference arrows. But each one of these arrows, these vertical arrows, which is just these L's leading to the V, are meant to represent inferences. That is, we go from the first statement there to the second statement, and from the second statement to the third statement. So one end of the arrow is the support, the other end of the arrow is the conclusion. And of course, the way I've done it here, the second statement there would be an intermediate conclusion or a non-basic premise, given the vocabulary that we were developing in the first week. So again, we could, that's actually, it's always an option in a course like this to go ahead and spend a lot of time doing argument diagramming. But it takes time to learn how to do. You can't rush through it. You have to give students time to go from diagramming simple arguments to diagramming slightly more complex arguments to diagramming things like tarred by tobacco, which are real world. I mean, there's a short argument. It's pretty easily done. But, it's time consuming. In any case, it is a good, it's something I thought about doing, but ultimately decided perhaps we could spend our time doing things that were a little different. But it's just it's the same thing. It's a kind of, analyze an argument, seeing what you have, and then once you know what you have in an argument, then going ahead and evaluating its strength.